1 year into Manfred's tenure. And, Jerry, as maybe you could tell there, we were talking about the All-Star game. I'm not sure that came up in your conversation with Rob Manfred, but a lot of interesting things did. And how does he feel 1 year after his first year on the job?
Well, I think he's pretty comfortable. He's kind of grown into the position, and he was the guy, to be honest with you, I think his position now is probably easier than the job he had before. He was the guy who had to bail baseball out of the Dodgers, Frank McCourt mess, and a lot of other difficult situations. And now he goes around and talks to people, and, obviously he's the guy who drives the vision, and he is going to have a challenge this year because they have to negotiate a new labor agreement, and that is going to be challenging because he has to deal with big market, small market owners, and so his style is a little bit different than Bud Selig, but I think he's pretty happy, and I think overall, when you look at the labor piece they've had and the money they're making and pretty good competitive balance, young stars, pace to play, a lot of things they've done have worked out well. So I think baseball's in a pretty good place right now.
Yeah, now, many people believe that this is a game that's skewing towards an older demo, that younger kids don't want to play the game, but there is a lot of young stars in the game. Does he feel that it's kind of having a revival? I mean, where does baseball sit? I guess economically it's in pretty decent shape. You're looking at these contracts, they're not getting any smaller, but, it seems that, little leagues and baseball all over the place just doesn't feel as popular as it once was.
Well, look, that's something that they've tried to address. It was pretty symbolic on day one in Washington when Rob Manfred was supposed to throw out the first pitch, and he gave the ball to a 9-year-old little leaguer and had him throw out the first pitch. And baseball is really trying to obviously get into that fantasy realm with some hiccups. They want to make the game available on some different outlets besides television. You want to have kids watch it on their phones or on tablets or, a sort of a younger demographic, as you mentioned, baseball skewing older. But, I think that's overblown a little bit. You go to teams during the season, and baseball isn't the big event kind of mentality, obviously, that you see in football, but they still draw pretty well. I mean, on a typical Sunday at a Phillies game, if they're half decent, you're going to see an awful lot of kids in the stands. But that's something that Rob Manfred has really made a priority moving forward. He does want to make the game more attractive to kids. He wants to get more of them playing. And in a strange sort of way, I think this whole flap and controversy about concussions in football, you hate to say would be a good thing for baseball, but you saw the comments by Antoine Randall a couple of weeks ago, where he said, hey, if I had to do it again, I probably would play baseball. And I think that's an opportunity. Obviously, it's not the way that baseball would have scripted it, but I do think it's an opportunity to reach out and get some more athletes who might have otherwise played football.
Jerry Crasnick's with us, ESPN.com. What, at this point so far, has been the toughest decision that the commissioner has had to make?
Well, he mentioned this to me in the piece, was far and away was the Pete Rose thing. I think he did really grapple with that situation. He was conscious of what Pete has contributed to the game. He understands the place Pete has in Major League Baseball. But I honestly felt like he didn't think that Pete had reconfigured his life, gotten away from the gambling, and, really was in a place where he could feel comfortable letting him back in the game. I mean, you let Pete back in the game, and, somehow or other, the Hall of Fame gets involved, and he might be going in that direction. And then he goes out and bats for, something happens, and, boy, it's a big can of worms for baseball. So I don't think that was an easy decision for him in terms of, personally, he was obviously aware of Pete's impact, and I think he had some sympathy for Pete. But in the end, he just couldn't make that plunge.
And Jerry, one of the other difficult jobs he's had, as we talked about the younger generation and possibly skewing away, whether it's real or imagined. One thing you can say about younger group as the attention span is growing smaller, whether it's social media, whether it's so many avenues to look at things. And people have criticized, obviously, the pace of baseball. Some of the rule changes he's had to at least think about addressing, whether it's the DH in the National League, whether it's changing the shifts, which would maybe up the entertainment value. How has that gone for him?
Well, I think he's, forward-looking, but has enough purist in him that he doesn't want to unnecessarily tinker with the game. Lack of offense has obviously been an issue. They could look at the strike zone. I guess you could always talk about lowering the mound or doing something like that. I mean, I do think they want to inject more offense into the game, but you certainly don't want to go down the PED road or the amphetamine road, and that's one way you would be able to do that. But baseball's already been there and done that to its displeasure. So I think there's some things he'd like to do, but look, baseball is what it is. It's not a game that's going to be up and down, and it's a thinking man's game, a thinking person's sport, and it does have a certain rhythm and taste to it, and I think that's one of the attractions to it. So they do want to get more kids playing, especially in the inner cities. Diversity is an issue. You want to get more African American athletes involved. You want to get more minorities in the front offices and in dugouts as well. So, I think baseball, as I said, is still in a pretty good place. People talk about Major League Baseball like it's a dead sport, but it's up to $9 to $10 billion in revenue. So I think they're definitely doing something right.
Yeah, Jerry, and they also spun off, as you mentioned, Major League Baseball Advanced Media. So monetarily, there certainly hasn't been a problem. But you mentioned something there that I had to ask about, and that's the lack of diversity in the game, at least when it comes to the African American community. Is that one of his biggest disappointments throughout the first year, and is that a key moving forward?
Yeah, I think they have to be a little bit disappointed. Obviously, Dusty Baker got hired, but you don't see a lot of black managers, in terms of minorities in the front office. The progress probably hasn't been as fast as you would like, for a sport that did so much for equality with Jackie Robinson. But baseball, instead of just sort of ranting and stomping their feet, I think they're really trying to improve the pipeline. They're identifying good young candidates in front offices and trying to get people involved. And I think we'll see progress in that area down the road. It isn't coming as quickly as you would like, but I guess it's not coming as quickly as you would like with the Academy Awards either. So it's a societal problem as much as a baseball problem.
Jared Crasnick's with us, ESPN.com. Major League Baseball set to get its pitchers and catchers ramped up in less than a month. You mentioned the DH in the National League. Now, in your piece, he kind of joked that that's something that he wish he wasn't, that he kind of joked more about. Is that something that is a realistic possibility that could be a change down the road?
I wasn't at the meeting last week. I think there have been a little bit of rumblings maybe from some of the more progressive, forward-looking people on National League clubs. And I think once that stuff got out there and he hashed it around, maybe he gets some angry or disappointed phone calls because he changed course a little bit on it. And look, the thing about Rob that's great is he'll hash out an issue. He'll debate it and discuss it publicly, and sometimes it creates a negative backlash. But I think that's a good thing. When we're in January and people are talking about Major League Baseball in any respect, I think that's largely a positive.
Yeah, and obviously that's much like the Pete Rose debate. Very passionate around people, the National League fans. I think a lot of them, including myself, not a big fan of bringing the DH to the National League. So that was something that really that stood out to me. We're talking with Jerry Crasnick here as he had that Q&A here with Rob Manfred. And, I don't know that you really discussed the All-Star game with him, but is that something that you think is still going to stay in place, that the game will count going forward?
Yeah, I wasn't able to get to everything. He had just come back from the owners' meetings, and there was the snowstorm, so I had about 20, 30 minutes with him, to talk to him and ask him some of these things. I don't have any indication or any real reason to believe that they're going to get away from this whole tying the World Series to the results of the All-Star game. I think that's more of a TV partner thing. Their TV partner wants it because it allows them to hype the game more. I'm not a huge fan of it. I just have seen too many mixed signals on it. You talk about the game meaning everything, but then you want to have every team represented. You want to have the players vote. You want to have the fans vote. And, you have guys coming out after 4 or 5 innings. So I think baseball's caught in the middle on this thing a little bit. And I'm not a huge fan of the concept, but I haven't ruined the All-Star game. And they feel like it helps increase TV viewership, and that's a big thing for them. So I don't see Rob shifting course on this or the owners anytime soon.
Hey, Jerry, you mentioned labor negotiations. Obviously, that's going to be a big thing moving forward. Traditionally, the players obviously have had one of the strongest unions anywhere, not just sports, but in the country. Is there any talk, when we see some of these contracts, and some of them are approaching third world country levels of GNP, is there any talk of a salary cap at any point being implemented into Major League Baseball?
No, there really isn't, and that's more of a philosophical thing. The Players Union has just never been big on player floors. They don't really subscribe to even floors on the minimum a team has to spend, and they're not big on salary caps. I think they feel like, hey, the open market should dictate, and it's actually been a strange market when you guys look at it this winter. I mean, we've had some huge contracts, obviously, David Price and Zach Greinke, $200 million plus. There's an awful lot of, the $2 to $3 to $5 million players. There's dozens of those guys still out there. So it's been a strange winter in that respect. But look, you can talk about payrolls being high, but the Kansas City Royals won last year. I think they had the 16th biggest payroll. The Yankees and Red Sox didn't make it to the postseason. Baseball's had pretty good parity, really, even relative to the NFL. The Giants won 3 years. The large market clubs haven't exactly, clubbed the small market clubs over the head. So I think in terms of parity with the wild card, typically you go into September and you might have 20, 22 teams still in it. I think they're pretty happy with it, but there's no way that anybody's going to consent to a salary cap. The union, as you mentioned, is the strongest in sports. They've resisted it since the early 70s, and there's no way they're going to start now.
Hey, Jerry, I know London has been a spot for the NFL. Do you anticipate baseball expanding internationally and also expanding more teams? Do you think that that's something that they're looking into as well, putting games internationally and also putting more teams into the league?
Yeah, it really is. I wrote a topic on it last week, and I think right now they might be looking towards, say, Mexico. You put a team in Mexico City. It's the 10th biggest city in the world. There's a lot of logistical issues and player security and, a million things you'd have to do. I think they'd think about going back to Montreal, maybe Vancouver, because you don't want to get into another small market where it's just going to be receiving subsidies from the affluent club. So I think there is a day when they would look to expand. And look, I think it'd be really cool to have a team in Sydney, Australia, but it's pretty hard to do that with the way the football season works. But we will see forays, abroad. And I think Rod Manfred told the Associated Press yesterday that they play a game in London here soon, kind of like the NFL does.
Yeah.
The problem is the baseball schedule is so compressed, and they play so many games you have to keep the travel reasonable.
Jerry Crasnick with us, senior baseball writer over at ESPN.com. While we have you, just a couple of quick thoughts on the Phillies. I know you wrote a piece, Mark Appel, the first pick in the 2013 draft. The Phillies made that deal to get him over here. He was a big part of that deal. I guess not originally in the deal, according to reports, but he ends up being a part of that deal. When you got a chance to talk to him, what do you think the future holds for the former number 1 overall pick?
Well, he's kind of a mystery man, I think nobody's given up on him yet. He's a big kid. He's got good stuff. He just hasn't had any kind of consistency. I think going to a new organization and getting away from Houston and maybe not having that burden of being the number 1 pick might help him. And he'll probably go to Lehigh Valley to start the season, and maybe they'll call him up at some point. And, I think generally scouts now think this guy might be a number 4 starter, 200-inning kind of guy, isn't going to be a top-of-the-rotation, Justin Verlander, type of guy, a real Cy Young contender. But, look, he can have a pretty nice career still. The guys that I looked at historically, maybe guys like Tim Belcher or Andy Bennett, they were picked number 1 in the draft, and they had pretty good careers. They seasons and 150, and I think if Capel could do that, everybody'd be free with it.
All right, the Phillies 22 days from pitchers and catchers will be down there. Jerry Crasnick has a full Q&A with the commissioner over at ESPN.com. And, of course, as we mentioned, the Phillies getting ready just less than a month. And some interesting stuff from Larry Bowa today. We'll play that audio a little later, though. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, guys.
Good stuff from Jerry Crasnick on the state of baseball, really, with Rob Manfred. The first said Pete Rose was the toughest decision he had to make.